Hello and welcome to today's CDCT live session. I'm Jason Rader from Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Division. Today we're talking about incident response with two good friends that also happen to be bona fide experts in this area. With me today are Jeremy Nelson, our Network Practice Director, and Doug Martin, our Incident Response Competency Lead here at CDCT. Welcome, gentlemen.
How's it going?
Thanks for having us, Jason.
So I'm excited. I think this is going to be a fun time today. Why don't we I like to get started by throwing kind of a softball out there. So what defines an incident from an incident response perspective?
So
not everybody.
Go ahead, Doug.
No, you go.
So for me, an incident is anything that requires some type of elevated response, right? Where when you look at it, there's some form of the business that's either in jeopardy, whether that's availability, whether that's actual financial data, whether that's PII for the individual employees, anything where sensitive information about an organization is either at risk, whether that risk is you can't access it and it's impeding the ability to actually operate your business, or it's being exfiltrated and being used in some type of use or fashion that I guess isn't aligned with your best practices. So usually when I think about engaging with organizations that are quantifying something as an incident, that's kind of how I try and put that into a box.
Doug, how about you? Any nuance to that?
Usually when my phone rings, it's the beginning of an incident. There's different levels. I think you really have to categorize those. The ones I think we're probably more concerned about are the ones that involve human intervention, where you're actually having to take some kind of action to prevent, or detect or contain some kind of activity.
Sure. No, and I think, having worked in circs before and those kinds of things, I mean, not every event that happens is necessarily an incident, but then based on what type of incident happens is how basically whether we need to escalate that thing up to, the analysts or to executives is kind of the gravity of what we're kind of looking at this point.
Yeah, if you have to tell somebody with a fancy title, it's probably an incident.
Or contact legal.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was something we kind of talked about a lot. I mean, is a lot of folks maybe when they think about this, they kind of keep it contained to the nuts and bolts operations guys from like the IT folks or the security folks for the greater part of things, but not having that mechanism to talk to legal or execs is definitely a big miss. If you then get into a situation where you have to, and you're not really good at that, right?
Yeah, communications, legal, executive. The last thing you want is for your CEO to get a call from somebody and say, "Hey," you get him caught. Anybody caught flat-footed that was going to interact with the public is definitely a big miss.
Yeah, and I think that's a big differentiator with organizations that have mature security practices, is usually you have somebody that is that layer that sits between the technology folks, the legal folks, the business folks, and helps them understand what that risk is, help them open up those channels of communication, especially when something out of the ordinary occurs.
Yeah. So, we'd like to give people, advice and those kinds of things. I think, Doug, your fire truck analogy was perfect last night. Why don't you let us have that?
Yeah, I think, incident response, if it's pretty well known that if you're a company and you have any internet presence at all, you're probably going to have to deal with some kind of incident at some point, probably in the next year or two, if you haven't had one already. And with that being said, practice is really important in incident response. Years ago, maybe not as much, but now it's absolutely required. And so the analogy I used was a fire truck. If you had a fire truck show up at your house at midnight and your house is on fire, had a nice brand new truck, all the best tools, right? The best hoses, whatever they need. And they're all reading a manual, trying to figure out how to work it, in front of your house. That probably would be a very good outcome, right? And so the same thing goes to incident response. Practice is really important. You have to not just write it down, but practice it.
And they might put the fire out, but it might be way later than it should have been put out in the first place, right?
Yeah, what's the loss, right? How much is lost while you're waiting for them to get through the manual?
Yeah, and that's really the definition of incident response for me is that our job is to limit the exposure to the company. That's the whole program should be focused around how do you contain and limit any kind of negative impact to your customer or to your company.
And I think, to be fair, the best aspects of incident response are the way that you mitigate the risk on the front end, right?
Yeah.
It's the old saying, there's no better defense than a good offense. So being out in front of the issue, understanding the environment, understanding what your risk thresholds are, and having, good defined understanding of your current state is huge. So when that incident does occur, you know exactly what you have in place to help with those immediate identification and containment efforts. So absolutely.
Yeah, I really can't think of any other part of the business where at 3 o'clock in the morning you'd be making huge, critical business impacting decisions that you've never discussed before. It really, you're just getting lucky sometimes, really, I think. And you look at the impact of certain breaches over the years, and why was one more impactful than the other?
Yeah.
A lot had to do with the way they handled it, quite frankly.
I think that's important to call out, Doug. I mean, a lot of the leaders and the different organizations that we work with and we communicate with, that is part of the overall attack, is to have it occur at very inopportune times. Some of them happening over holiday weekends or during end of quarter, end of year cycles. Like there's absolutely a strategy on when that timing occurs to get people caught flat-footed, because it does make the response a lot more challenging.
Fridays at 5, you can guarantee it. You're going to have one.
Truly. And I think, to your same point, you can be totally caught off guard, even if you've got the good tech side of things. I mean, one of the, in recent memory, I can recall like folks not knowing who can authorize to spend money, and I'm not talking about buy Bitcoins. I'm just talking about in general, bring partners in or folks to help who can authorize this in the middle of the night on a Saturday. It was one of those things where they had a lot of other things. They knew who they were going to call, but they didn't have the right stuff put into place to be able to figure that stuff out.
Yeah, we call it a resume generating event. If if you're if you don't have a plan in place, right? It takes a while to put in a statement of works and language and all the different things that I think having a retainer is really important. Already having that all negotiated in advance with a partner or whoever is going to help you during that time.
Yeah, and I think that retainer thing, it's a lot of folks think about that negotiated rate. We've kind of got that in place, or that we know the people who we're going to call when that goes down. But I think just as important of that is the access that's already been provided to the group that you've got an arrangement to call. Like just being able to get those guys into your systems or on site or those kinds of things. That's a huge amount of effort in some places. Some places it's just a no-go until you go through the appropriate channels to get there. So that can really be a stopping the ability to get to the fire quickly.
Yep. Yeah. And if I could, to even bring this back to Doug's analogy a little bit earlier, is it's the practice component. Just like disaster recovery, or even if we take a step away from the IT world and we think about emergency response, whether that be related to earthquake or other type of natural disasters, going through those as a community, having the plan and then executing that plan and understanding where your gaps might be, realizing the executives that you need to connect with, the partners that you need to get into your systems, going through that from soup to nuts to see how that flows, so that where those pain points are going to be, so that when that event does occur, you're not figuring out then.
Yeah, I was working on some research last night, and there's a really interesting metric. If you have a incident response plan and it's practiced tabletop at least twice a year, you save on average about $1.2 million off of incident costs and impact across the board. So you look at the cost of having those practices, it takes people's time. I know that's important, but you're looking at 7-figure savings return on your investment. And if you agree that you're going to have some kind of event that require that in the next year or two, it seems like the cost benefit there is really, really strong.
Yeah, sorry, Jason.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's very similar to like the disaster recovery. I think, when we look back at some of the events that have occurred over the past 10, 15 years that have prompted a significant amount of investment in disaster recovery, that's a known practice that many organizations embrace today, going through, standing up that infrastructure, having those procedures, and then on a monthly, quarterly, very routine basis, shutting down primary data centers, making sure that everything's operational and failing back. And I think that's another interesting one, is how do we get back? So once we're in the event state, how do we get out? Because sometimes you get stuck, right? You kind of get stuck in a remediation or a containment effort, and there has to be some way to get out and get back to normal operating procedures.
Perfect. So we've talked about a couple of things that I think are important to kind of stress is that, get the execs involved, get legal involved more than just the IT or security teams involved. We talked about preparation, getting a plan into order because you don't want to be doing Google searches when things are going down. And then that whole, I think not just, but integrating it with the disaster recovery plan. This is just as much of a disaster as some of the other disaster type stuff. And then those tabletop exercises are critical, I think. And Doug, that stat you said was the average, which meaning if you're a larger organization, it's probably significantly larger than 1.2 million. And for, so I think a lot of folks, we probably understand, I hope we understand this a little bit better than most folks do, but let's talk about the phases. I mean, I think we've talked about this whole preparation aspect, which is definitely a phase. Let's have a construct of what kind of the phases of an incident would be. And I know there's a 4-step model. I know there's a 6-step model. So let's just kind of put it in order, some semblance of order. Go ahead.
I think there's a preparation stage, which we've been talking about a little bit. There's a detection phase. And these overlap, right? They're not necessarily linear in that one stops and it begins. There's a detection, then there's a containment. When you found something, you want to put a fence around it. Yep. Once you're able to do that, you want to do an expulsion or a removal event where you sometimes that is really an event where you're dropping the axe, so to speak, and cutting off the bad guy or guys. And then there's a recovery phase, and then there's a really important at the end, a lessons learned phase. Or a post-event phase. It's funny because the two bookends are really important, the preparation and the lessons learned. And unfortunately, as an industry, we probably invest the least amount of money and time in those two. We spend a lot of money in the middle at the tools and detecting, which is really important, and then even the responding to that. But the other sides are not strong. The middle is going to be weak.
And I think Oh, sorry, Jason.
No, go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to, one thing that I think was really important that Doug highlighted that we've seen when supporting organizations that have gone through these types of events is this is not a waterfall, right? I know Doug just barely mentioned that, but I think it's worth calling out that this isn't, hey, we're going to do this step and then it immediately rolls in, once we've identified, then we roll into containment, then we, it's this nice even flow. Not at all. In fact, we're continuously going through this cycle of we'll go through, we'll identify, we'll start containment, we'll begin containment efforts, but then at the same time something else gets identified, and then we have to readjust containment efforts, and then we start moving into remediation, then we find ourselves back into identification. So it is very much a fluid type of a response timeline, and you kind of move through those phases in and out as the overall incident requires. But and one other thing that I did kind of want to tag on to the end of Doug's is that even if we are doing the lessons learned, what we lots of times what we see is that we don't follow that up with like a fortification step where we're taking those lessons learned and actually turning that into action and investment to prevent against future incidents.
Yeah, I know we've talked about before that there's that don't waste an incident. If something happens, right, take advantage of that. And one of the stats that I've seen are around 90 days. You have about a 90-day window from the end of a large event in which you can execute a lot of change in an environment. And after that, it seems to falls off dramatically for whatever reason. There's not a lot of time frame to go from an incident to lessons learned to a fortification components, and especially in a large enterprise.
Yeah, and what do you mean by not letting it go to waste or not missing an opportunity there?
Highlighting what happened, right? More than just, how did it happen? Why did we get to the position we got to? And then what can we do to make sure we don't go there again?
You mean we shouldn't just sweep it under the rug and pretend like it never happened and hope nobody notices? I'm too pretty for prison. So we don't keep anything under rugs.
I think, oh, sorry, Doug, go ahead.
No, I'm finished.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's just like a lot of stuff that we experience in the IT world is that we're always trying to prove a negative, right? And we're trying to do the right thing. We have a lot of smart people in the industry who are continuously trying to drive that ball forward, but you're always trying to prove a negative. You're trying to get investment to avoid something. Well, when an incident occurs, now you're no longer in avoidance. Now you're like, hey, this is real. This is no longer this phantom thing that could possibly happen. We've seen what this actually does to our business. Yeah. Maybe we should start doing some of those things that we talked about before this happened.
Yeah, it's trouble. I think if you do your job right, nothing happens, and that's a tough way to budget. You know what I'm saying? It's it's absolutely true. I can recall, when different things are going down and virus outbreaks and those kinds of things, but it's the same kind of fashion. The guys that were prepared and really did a good job and were vigilant and weren't part of that attack or whatever went down, those guys don't get the high fives or anything. It's just kind of business as usual. It's the guys that got crippled by the event are the ones that are like now getting the investment or maybe we should pay more attention to this kind of thing. So that's another tough thing. But I think with the stats that we've all seen recently, like Gartner and all these folks coming out with these stats, I think, ransomware attacks are going to happen every 11 seconds next year. Just crazy stuff will be going on. These kinds of things are important to folks. So, that being said, now I guess we should probably focus on where do we start? What do folks do? What if somebody's sitting there, and let's hope this isn't the case, but they're like, man, we are really deficient in our cybersecurity or incident response mechanisms here. What's kind of the good advice for these guys?
I think you pick a framework, any of the NIST or one of the others, and start figuring out exactly where you need to do what work. And if you have nothing, start by coming up with a document that says these are the things that we want to do inside these different phases, and then come up with a strategy and a roadmap and begin implementing that. With the big footnote, you got to test it. You got to try your plan. It's got to involve executives or leaders from other teams like legal and finance is a big important factor in that as well.
Well, and it's probably fair to say most folks that are operating a business probably have that plan sitting somewhere. They may need to dust it off, update the call trees, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's the testing part is probably a really good exercise for these guys to kind of, first you got to get on the agenda. You got to let everybody know, hey, testing is important. It's got to be scheduled just like everything else and get the attention of the folks.
I would say sorry about that. I was going to say that I think another important piece of having the plan is one piece. So recognition, just like anything, just recognizing that you have a problem is probably the first step. The second one is getting that plan, like Doug said. But I think it's really important that you have someone who really owns it, someone who's passionate about this, someone who really does have that risk analysis type of a perspective on the world, and really having them own that plan, because they're going to be the person that is, because just like we said earlier in the conversation, the plan is great when it's on paper, but at what point does the rubber meet the road? And you need somebody who's going to be that champion to make sure that the testing happens, that we have the right communications, that we have the right contacts, tools, partners engaged, so that when that event does happen, it's just like it executes exactly like he had planned.
Well, and I think it's really important that somebody have ownership of it to basically as the catalyst for it. But it's also really important for senior executives, C-level folks, to make sure that everybody knows that they play a part in this. It's not that one person's problem. It's not Jeremy's or Doug's or Jason's problem. It's the whole company's problem. We all are attacking this, and it's part of an overall program that's got to be done. And we didn't just do it. Oh, we did that last year. No, it's something that's going to continually be happening in the organization.
Yeah,
and that's such a good call out, Jason, because when the event occurs, everyone's impacted. Everyone down to the lowest level person within the organization is going to have their world disrupted by that event. And so recognizing that everyone has a part to play in the overall life cycle of getting out of that event is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think Jason, a good point about being owned by an individual. It's not even owned by a single group. It's not a security problem. It's a business issue. And the more I think security leadership can push that up into the organization, that it's our problem, not our problem. So the global we, so to speak. And then feel free to use the fireman analogy. How many times do you want your fire truck to be practiced and tested? Right? I want that pretty regular. When they show up, I want water on the house right away.
Yeah, and every time when you get a new truck, you got to change the procedures that you go through. When you get new firemen, you got to change the procedures that you go through. And another thing that we were kind of working through this, back to that fire analogy that we've been using, is I saw on the news recently, there's an outbreak of fires in, California. And I saw a, film of a helicopter coming in, and it was a guy, he was getting carabiners and those kinds of things ready to hook some firemen too that they were rescuing that were surrounded by fire. And when the camera finally got to these guys' faces, they were like, normal day at work. I was so impressed with these guys. I mean, they're awesome anyway, but for them to just be like, yeah, here comes do you want to clip in first? Me clip in. I mean, they were so confident about this. And what struck me with that is they had practiced this before. They knew what was going to happen in this situation. They felt very confident about what was going on. They still were in a bad situation, but that fact that they knew what was going on allowed them to do the things that they knew were going to happen before and after that. All of those things were going to fall into place because they were very prepared for this situation.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that Doug highlighted, and actually you have as well, Jason, like, again, to kind of continue down this this kind of this firefighter type of a theme here, and bringing it back to the IT, is that recognizing that there are groups outside of just IT or technology that are critical to that remediation. So as we think about the firefighters, you've got you also have the water, right? So you've got the actual fire hydrant in a certain location that has to be tested. We need to make sure that water's there. That's not the fire department. That's, the public utility organization. So again, there's a lot of collaboration, both internally and externally, to really make sure that you have the team prepared to actually respond to that critical event.
Well, fantastic. I'm sorry, Doug, one sec. When we bring up that aspect, I think that down level, resources that you're not going to have on staff. We've seen situations where there needed to be somebody to negotiate a ransom have to be brought in, and you're not going to have that guy sitting on staff waiting for a time. But
you got big problems. If you can justify having that guy on staff full time, you've got other things you need to work on.
I'll send you my resume if you can get that much buy-in.
Yeah, no doubt. What were you going to say, Doug?
No, you covered it. We're good.
Got ya. But I think that's what the really interesting thing. And I think, if you look at, kind of the SANS phases of this, the preparation, the stuff that Doug already went through, preparation, obviously preparing from a fire perspective, identification, is this something that we need to act on? Not, sometimes it's not an actual fire. Sometimes it's a campfire or those kinds of things. The containment, the eradication, or the, getting it out of there, recovery, another important thing. And then the lessons learned. I think, again, from a fire perspective, what got us into this situation? Was it, carelessness? Was it combustible things over here? I think all of those things is really important. And I think that lessons learned is, like you guys said, a massively critical effort that hopefully if the team is doing their job right, that it keeps becoming an important aspect of what's talked about at the most high levels, but also, only you can prevent forest fires. We didn't rehearse that, but I think we've got to make sure that everybody's a part of this solution, right? And I think pushing that down, your users are just as good at keeping fires from happening as the firemen are, right?
And one, if we take that one step further, right, we don't want our users to be the fire starters. Just exactly. Education, right? Like education and how they can help prevent some of these attacks. I mean, high percentage of the overall incidents and situations that we have to respond to started with one person not following some best practices. So I think that's, again, just making people aware of the plan, having them be bought in, having them be part of it, helps them maybe not be a fire starter as well.
Sure.
And one more thing that I was just kind of thinking of there, Jason, as you're making your comment, is that, we've been talking about this, and I think lots of people fall into this trap where we talk about these different phases and it feels very linear, right? Similar to I was talking about, like when you're in the middle of it, you're bouncing around, but it really is cyclical, right? We have the preparation, we go through identification, containment, remediation, or expulsion, lessons learned, but then we need to go right back into planning, right? Yep. It really does need to be this continuous round of preparedness.
Yeah, I think there are two really important components to. There's a lot of important pieces inside incident response, but the preparation, like we talked a lot about the training, practicing your response, and then identifying, doing some targeted threat hunting or some compromised assessments to see if there's somebody already in the environment that you're not able to catch. Because a lot of times, you get caught looking at through the same microscope, so to speak, at your environment. It's good to have somebody come from the outside and look at your environment and just specifically look for indicators of compromise. Sorry. One of those that real quick, Jason, is the time of detection. It continues. It hasn't really shrunk in 10 years. So, even more effort around that, I think, would be the key piece to a successful plan.
That was exactly what I was going to say. Is I was just talking to somebody recently, and we were talking about the fact that before like a ransomware attack happens, because they were asking, well, how do they get into all of the databases? And I was like, well, it's because they watched how the organization worked. They watched what was important before they pulled the trigger on this thing so that they could get the maximum amount of impact over this campaign that they were running. It's run like a business. So that dwell time that you're talking about, Doug, is, yeah, it's way better to cut this off before it actually happens, right, than it is to just be responding to fires all the time. And I think that's definitely good parting advice for folks. Is it's way better to deal with a fire before it starts.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jason. And some of the conversations that we've had with leaders within organizations that we work with is, you highlighted that the people coming in doing the bad things learned their business, learned their behaviors, learned where the valuable information, really what makes their business tick. They learned that stuff before they did anything because they know where the value is. And I think it's just as equally important for IT leaders to do the same thing, like whether that's through a risk advisory board, but figuring out a way, building a matrix for as events occur, or not necessarily even events, but even as potential threats occur, that you can run it through a risk analysis and understand what that really means to your business, and then feed that into this overall preparedness cycle.
Well, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, understand where are the crown jewels that we're trying to protect.
Yes.
Do we need to put the same protections on absolutely everything in the organization? That's cost prohibitive. Let's figure out where the right stuff is. Let's get rid of a bunch of kindling that's all over the place that is combustible that we don't need to have. There's data and other things that just expose us to risk. So yeah, this is, I know a lot of folks would love to think about this as a very specific and confined thing that they need to focus on, but it's an overall security program is what's going to save you ultimately from all of this, and how it relates culturally into your organization. You've definitely hit a nerve, because I'm really passionate about this. It's not just this one little sliver of a thing. It's an overall programmatic approach that's going to save us.
Yeah. And I think it even goes the opposite side, is that if you swing the pendulum too far in the other direction, now you're burning cycles on something that the risk is extremely low, but because it got a certain flag, you're investing all of these resources into remediating something that really didn't have an impact on your business.
Yeah, the peanut butter methodology doesn't work anymore. You spread it evenly across the bread everywhere. It just doesn't. There's an old bank robber that was really prolific, and when they finally arrested him, they asked him, "How come you rob banks?" He said, "Because that's where the money's at." And so figure out where your money's at, and figure out the path to get to your money, and that's where I would recommend making the investments.
Oh, I love it. Well, gentlemen, it has been. I think we probably should do this again, because it's just such a lively conversation. I think a lot of folks care about it, and I think that the stuff that we've talked about today has been really, interesting, and I think the way that it ties everything together is really key. You guys have any parting words for our folks? Like, where should they get started, or those kinds of things?
Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. So look for
I like
smoke.
it.
That's a good one.
That's on message, so we'll end with that. But, thanks, guys. You guys are awesome. I really appreciate it again, and we'll probably be back on this particular topic. But thank you, Jeremy Nelson. Thank you, Doug Martin. You guys are awesome. And if you folks out there would like more information about the types of things that we're talking about, please visit us at insightcdct.com. Thanks, and have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. See you, Doug.
Thanks, Jason. See you later.